Everybody ready? Ready?
Yeah.
All right, listen.
It's your weekend show.
Quiet, numbskulls, I'm broadcasting.
With Bob Biermann.
It's great.
Can you believe the month of April is almost coming to an end? Yeah, this is the last weekend in April. Welcome to your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. You know, these past 2 months, almost now, I guess it is 2 months, we have been spending some time going down, shall we say, memory lane. You know, I started a program one day, and I had this thought to answer a question that somebody gave me on how I got started in the radio business, what led me there. And over the past several weeks, if you've been listening, I've been sharing this story about what led me into a career in radio. Now, it's not the only thing I've done in my life. I've done a few other things along the way and even to this day, but radio has been a huge part of my life, starting on the radio at a hobby radio station I told you about in upstate New York, listening to the radio in big cities like New York City as a kid, and then getting on the air by the 1970s, early 1970s. And I spent that first, 7, 8 years of my life just being a radio announcer for the most part. And then I made a transition into the engineering side. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. If you are new to the radio show, let me give you something right up front you can remember. If you'd like to contact us, that's our website, which is yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. And we also maintain a Facebook page, and that page can be found at Your Weekend Show. I have learned if you make Your Weekend Show one word, it comes right up in a Facebook search. You can find out what's going on and some of the latest episodes and information about them from our Facebook page as well. And it means a lot to me, if you're a regular listener, to let me know that you are listening. I'm amazed each and every week that the emails that do come in from places all over North America, even overseas into Europe and other locales into the Middle East even, we hear from people. We're also heard on this program on the Voice of Hope, which broadcast in the continent of Africa from Zambia in the eastern part of Africa, and it covers a pretty good part of that continent and all the way up into Europe and even the Middle East as well. We are thankful for all the radio stations that do air this program. And a lot of people I know listen online from the website, from Spreaker and other locations like Rackman Christian Radio also airs this program, plus some terrestrial stations. So if you do find some time to let me know you're listening, remember the website. You can email me from there, or if you just need the email address directly, it is bob@yourweekendshow.com. That is bob@yourweekendshow.com. And I want you to know those emails come directly to me. Nobody else sees them, so you can speak to me directly from that email address, bob@yourweekendshow.com. Would you maybe take some time this weekend or the first part of this coming week and let me know that you have heard and do listen to your weekend program? It means a lot to me, as this is a labor of love. We come here each and every week to share about life, this experience that we go through. All of us have a story to tell, every one of us. And our stories are all important. I share from my life some of the things that I've gone through, both the good and the bad, the difficult, the tragedies, the triumphs, all of it. I try to share with you, and I'm always amazed at how many people can identify with similar things in their life, experiences like I've gone through. And it's really what life is all about. And it seems to transcend cultures across the world, the things we go through. We all have times of joy. We all have times of difficulty. We all have times of struggle, challenges, even sorrow and pain and heartbreak. but it's all a part of what our life is all about. Like I said, during these past couple of months, I have shared with you this radio journey that I took. And it was an interesting journey, to say the least. I mean, as a kid, I used to listen to radio announcers and wonder maybe someday I could do something like that. And I never thought that I could. I mean, they had better voices than I did. They're on these big radio stations. What could I do, especially when I was around 16, dreaming about the idea of being a radio announcer? And little did I know that dream would actually come to a reality, one step at a time. Radio was good to me in those years. Now, I'm going to tell you the bad side about radio along with the good. Yeah, being on the air can be fun. Answering the request line is a blast. I'll tell you, it really is. You get to talk to people that look up to you. And if you were raised like I was, a bit shy and a bit insecure about your abilities, to suddenly find yourself in a different place where people admire you, people respect you, was huge. I really wanted to, at a younger age, spend my life just on the air. I thought that I would just do my entire career to the day that I retired, just being a radio announcer. But you know, the industry has a tendency, like any industry, to change over time. It's never the same. The radio we had back in the 1960s and 1970s was vastly different than radio in the 1930s and 40s and into the early 1950s. Back then, radio was, well, variety programs, comedy shows, dramatic presentations. It wasn't a disc jockey playing music. That came later when television arrived, and all those variety programs, the dramas, the westerns, and the comedies gradually moved to television and left radio behind. And by the end of the 1950s, most radio stations had adapted some kind of a music format for the most part. I was raised during that time of television. I remember watching so many of the TV shows, especially in the 1960s, The Wonderful World of Disney, Flipper. Remember that TV show? Gilligan's Island. I can rattle them all off. I remember them all so well. F Troop is another one of my favorites. By the late 1960s, even Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. I watched some TV, but I still listen to the radio. And the image you get listening to the radio, especially if you listen from stations coming out of big cities like a Chicago, a New York, a Los Angeles, a Dallas, Texas, Miami, Florida, Cleveland, Ohio, just to name a few off the top of my head, Boston, Massachusetts, wherever you lived, maybe Detroit, Michigan. You may have heard some of the big stations. And it seemed such a glamorous job. And everybody wanted to be in it, if they could get in it, that had a voice. There was a lot of competition. There are a lot of radio stations out there. Only a handful were the big radio stations like the New York Cities or the Detroits or the Atlantas or whatever the case may be. Those big stations were not as many, and the jobs highly competitive. Then there were a lot of medium-sized towns like a Rochester or Syracuse, New York. Smaller towns like an Anderson, South Carolina, places that I've been and I remember, or even a Toccoa, Georgia. You can probably name small-town radio stations in the United States and Canada that you remember. Even stations if you lived overseas and in places if you live in Europe. You remember stations, most of yours, though, were operated by your governments, not so much privately. But radio was still, well, radio. And at least in the world that I was raised, it had a tendency to be a one-on-one medium, a radio announcer playing the music just for you, along, of course, with some commercials, which many of I can still remember to this day. Radio was a fun industry. It really was. But radio has a dark side, and I think I've been spared from that. And this is one of the lessons and one of the things I want to share with you today. Sometimes that the footlights, like they would say if you're in the stage or theater, can be very alluring. And what we think radio is sometimes, or any other business like it that deals with the public and you are a celebrity of sorts, it's oftentimes not what it's cracked up to be when you get inside. Now, for me, I can honestly say I was spared most of the downfall that could occur to people in radio. I saw it in the 1970s. People that were older than I was, and they were in the radio business, and they didn't make a lot of money, but they only knew how to be a radio announcer. They weren't really qualified to do anything else. That's all they knew how to do, was spin records and talk into a microphone. And some were just fair. They were okay. But you knew when you listened to them, they would never make it to a big city and make the big paycheck. They hung on. They just hung on, hoping that someday maybe they too could be on a big radio station in Los Angeles, or maybe a big station in a Phoenix, Arizona, or some other place like a Seattle, or a New York, or a Washington, or a Charlotte. Many of those people, life in the radio business was difficult and not easy. A lot of people that were radio announcers that I knew over the years, their marriages failed. They lost touch with their children. They lived very meager lives, hoping for something better, always trying to get to the next, we called it a gig in the business, the one that paid a little bit more per week than the one you had. And you were hoping that someday you could afford to buy, a nicer car, or maybe a nicer place to live. But you never seemed to have quite enough money. A lot of them never did, because they hung their career to be a personality in an industry that is so competitive. And only a handful of the radio stations out of the thousands across the United States pay the big dollars. That's just the truth of the industry as it is. But somehow I am fortunate that I was spared so much of that. I came in at a time when radio was riding, especially on the AM dial, and FM was growing at the same time, kind of at a peak for its time. But something inside of me during that time, I enjoyed those years that I was a disc jockey and played the records. I did some news, but I opened my horizons to a little bit more about the business than just sitting behind a microphone, pushing buttons and playing records and talking. There was more to the radio business, and that's what it is truly at its essence. It is a business. It requires people to sell advertising. It requires people to research music. It requires people to do the engineering, the technical, which is relatively, especially back in those days, it took a special skill. And the number of engineers compared to the number of people wanting to be radio announcers, there was a big difference. There were a lot less of the real engineers compared to those that wanted to be a personality. And something inside of me told me to move away from being just on the air and to learn more about the technical side. I didn't understand it. I really, to this day, I think I know where the voice came from. I really do. There was that voice inside. I'm a person that believes in divine intervention and providence. And somewhere along the way, the thought came to get off the air and move to the engineering side if I'm going to stay in this business, if I'm going to have any kind of stability and a relatively decent income. It's time to hang up the headphones, as we said back in the day, and move on to another part of the business. During that time I was an engineer. I worked for a few stations, and I did some traveling because I was pretty good at my craft. And I would go from town to town in places in Georgia, Mississippi, up into North Carolina, even upstate New York and Ohio. And I'd come to these big stations and then many of these small stations where I'd find what I call the hangers-on, these guys that are older than I am, making way less than I am making as an engineer, but trying to, make it as a disc jockey. And how many stories you hear about divorces, child support, trying to stay ahead of child support payments and alimony payments and moving up and down the dial. There was a TV show back in the, late 70s, early 80s, WKRP in Cincinnati, and the theme song talked about, moving up and down, traveling up and down the dial. And it sounds all so good, and there is some fun to be had, but it can be, for many, a very difficult life. It wasn't that many months ago that I shared a song on this program. I'm going to share it again as I make this transition and talk about the radio business from a different side and where, by literally divine providence, I ended up as we got into the 1980s. The bulk of my disc jockey career was all between the years of 1970 and 1979. Beyond that, I did very little in terms of playing records on the radio or CDs when they came out or the computers. I didn't do that much in terms of on air after 1979. It became a very tiny part of my life, and I very seldom was behind a microphone, but I still enjoyed life. I still got to be in the radio business. I had some flexibility in my hours, and I enjoyed that immensely, having that flexibility. But like I say, I think of so many people that I've met over the years that started their careers maybe just before I did, in the early 1960s, and some, a handful, made it to the big stations. And I interviewed a good friend of mine a couple of years ago on this program that did very well for himself in radio, working in the big stations in Los Angeles and in the Chicagos and Detroits and New York. He made it. He made the big dollars. And he also knew and understood the business to this very day and retired with a good income. But there's so many that I've met that are hangers-on, that are just barely making ends meet now that they're in retirement. And they wonder how and what they could have done differently in their lives. So many of those stories are so sad, of those that I have met in my lifetime, especially in the late 70s and into the 80s and up to the early 1990s. I did some traveling, and I'd go to a few radio stations, and there you'd find these guys where time had left them behind, and radio is going in a different direction, and they just don't fit. They don't belong. And they're hoping for that next gig that might pay just enough money to make ends meet. It is such a sad song for those that live that life. And this song from Harry Chapin really does show the darker side of the radio industry. This is your weekend show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann.
Hello, honey, it's me. What did you think when you heard me back on the radio? What did the kids say when they knew it was their long-lost daddy-o? Remember how we listened to the radio, and I said that's the place to be. And how I got the job as an FM jock the day you married me. It was 2 kids and I was into AM rock, but I just had to run around. It's been 8 years since I left you, babe. Let me tell you about what's gone down. I am the morning DJ at WOLD, playing all the hits for you, wherever you may be. The bright good morning voice who's heard but never seen, feeling all of 45, going on 15. The drinking I did on my last big gig, it made my voice go low. They said that they liked the young sound when they let me go. So I drifted on down to Tulsa, Oklahoma to do me a late night talk show. Now I've worked my way down home again near to Boise, Idaho. That's how this business goes. I am the morning DJ at WOLD, playing all the hits for you wherever you may be. The bright good morning voice who's heard but never seen, feeling all of 45 going on 15. I'm making extra money doing high school sock hops. I'm a big time guest MC. You should hear me talking to the little children and listen what they say to me. I got a spot on the top of my head, just begging for a new toupee. There's a fire around my gut from sitting on her, but it's never gonna go away. Sometimes I get this crazy dream that I just take off in my car. But you can travel on 10,000 miles and still stay where you are. Thinking that I should stop this jockeying and start that record store. Maybe I could settle down if you take me back once more. Okay, honey, I see. I guess he's better than me. Sure, old girl, I understand. You don't have to worry, I'm such a happy man. I am the morning DJ at WOLD, playing all the hits for you wherever you may be. The bright good morning voice who's heard but never seen. What did he say? Feeling all of 45 going on 15. I am the morning DJ at WOLD.
Harry Chapin, the song WOLD. Kind of a really somber song, a sad song about some of those people in the radio business, many that I met along the way that never did make much of their lives. They banked everything on being a famous radio announcer and making the big dollars in a big station, but they never got there. They worked the smaller and medium markets, and as the radio business changed, they were kind of left behind. That's where I'm so thankful in my life, that I never stayed just being a radio announcer. It was fun for the years that I did it, and during a time where you could make a pretty good living in some stations, and I was very fortunate to get to some of those stations and not stay just in a tiny market and never getting anywhere beyond that point. And for that, it was good for myself and my family. It was fun while it lasted. And a lot of things in life, we go through phases and stages where these are things you do for a season, not for a lifetime. And for me, I'm very blessed that that never happened, where I fell into that trap. Once again, if you're just tuning in, this is your weekend show, and I am your host, Bob Biermann. We're so glad you're taking some time to be with us today. I want to remind you about the webpage. Our webpage is yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. If you're just tuning in and hearing me maybe for the first time, we also are on Facebook. You can look for us at Your Weekend Show. So during these past several weeks, I've shared the experience of getting started in radio, the interest from listening, and then a hobby station, then my first real job. And I did all the things that radio announcers did back in that time, trying to get to the next bigger station. I did it. I was successful at it for a season. But that voice inside of me said, it's time to maybe consider something a little different in the business. That being a radio announcer may not be as cracked up as it appears to be. Now, there was nothing on the horizon, technically or otherwise, that would have given me a clue of what would happen to radio in just over a decade from that point. But something said to move away from being on air. And so I did. And for a number of reasons, looking back now, I see a divine intervention in all that. We made the decision to leave the on-air behind. And I did some apprentice work at a smaller radio station in upstate New York for a while. Got my FCC license. It was a directional AM, which required it. And from there, I can only tell you it is by a miracle that I got my first real full-time engineering job at a rather large radio station in Atlanta, Georgia. I was up against a number of probably vastly more qualified candidates than I was, but somehow it just worked out. And I learned a lot very quickly in that first station, taking on a huge responsibility, actually more than I probably should have taken on, to be quite honest. I did, and I'm so thankful that I did. I'll admit it was a strange transition, no longer coming into a studio to sit down to play music any longer. That my only job now was to keep a radio station on the air, to build new studios and maintain the equipment that they had at the time, and maybe go out on remotes to make sure that all that worked correctly. It was a different time going into the 1980s. It was funny, like I say, no longer playing the music. And I noticed, too, maybe you were alive during that time, how the 50s had their own sound, the 60s their own sound that gave way to the 70s in spite of the disco music that kind of filtered into the 70s as well. And then the 80s began to make a change and had a sound all of its own. And to a degree, listening to this new-sounding music almost sounded foreign to my, well, at that time, still fairly young ears. It was like a totally different world as the 70s did give way to the 1980s.
Her hair is hollow gold, her lips sweet surprise, her hands are never cold, she's got Betty Davis eyes. Oh, Sherry,
The 1980s had arrived, and with it a whole new set of circumstances for many of us who were raised in the generation that I was, a time that you begin to come more of age as you come into your 30s. And life is a little bit different when you get around 30 years of age. I had hung up the headphones. I was now employed as a full-time chief engineer for a rather large radio station in Atlanta, Georgia. And like I said before, this transition, getting this job is divine intervention. I learned a lot in that job. But there were some really good benefits to that job as well. Besides the fact that it had a pretty good paycheck, it also came with some very good medical benefits, which I never had considered much prior to that time. Hey, I'm young. Who cares? My wife is maybe 12 years my senior, but still young. We never thought too much in terms of needing to use health insurance. We didn't have any health issues. A lot of people, when they're younger, don't think about things like that. I remember working at this radio station. We lived just outside of Atlanta, and my wife worked part-time, not because she had to, just because she liked to work for a few hours a day. And I would take her to work sometimes, and she had a friend that would take her home instead of her having to always drive. And this place that she worked at was a large drugstore that had a cosmetic counter. She actually sold cosmetics, and we would get there around 8:30, 8:45 in the morning, and they had a luncheonette counter there as well. And we would have a bite of breakfast, and I would head on to Atlanta, and she would do her thing till sometime after lunch and come home. One day we went to work as usual. Everything was fine, and around lunchtime I get a call from her boss at that drugstore saying she is not feeling well at all. She's got some severe pain. You need to come get her and take her to a doctor as soon as you can. I remember leaving the radio station and coming right back to Marietta, Georgia, where we were living at, and I picked her up, and she just looked terrible. And I was able to take her to her doctor right away. And without going into all the detail, it required emergency surgery before that afternoon was out, and I almost lost her at that time. I'm thankful we had the medical benefits that we did because it covered 100% of everything. And had this happened a year or two before I had taken this engineering job, who knows what the outcome would have been and how it would have affected us financially for years after because of the emergency surgery. And it affected her in many ways, too, for a number of years, physically, for a long time recuperation. One of the things we ended up doing because of the surgery she had and the long period of recoup, I decided to get away from being at a radio station because there were some demands when you work at a radio station. You're on call 24/7, which means if something happens, and it often did at 1 o'clock in the morning, you had to get out of bed and drive to the radio station or the transmitter site and make a repair, sometimes in a bad thunderstorm, whatever. It was not bad, but it does take its toll after a while to leave your wife at home and not be there. I decided I needed a more normal job. And we looked and we did some thinking, and to make a long story short, within about a 2-year period of time, I ended up working for a manufacturer of broadcast equipment. This company made transmitters for radio stations, AM, FM, and even shortwave. And that's another part of the story we'll be talking about maybe next week or the week after, the shortwave side of it. I had listened to shortwave radio on and off over the years. When I was younger, I had one of those radios that was an all-band radio. I didn't listen that much because most of the broadcasts you would receive were in a foreign language for the most part. But it was interesting and it was fascinating to me, and I never really knew the world because I was so busy in my, disc jockey world to think too much about the rest of the world and Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America and all the other national voices that were out there around the world. But when I made that transition from working at a radio station as an engineer to manufacturing broadcast equipment, it was very steady work, very reliable hours and weekends off, and we had the benefit of a good paycheck, good benefits again, and also, time to spend with each other without worrying about a pager going off. You remember those things, a pager to alert you needed to come in, or the phone calls that came in the middle of the night? All that came to an end. We made that transition as well. And what I had learned in working at a radio station and the intense, I always call it a baptism by fire, with the size and scope of the facility that I had to learn and study and work so hard in to get good at what I did, paid off to get me this job with a transmitter manufacturer. And there I learned even more than I had ever thought I would ever learn about the business and about the engineering side. When you actually are building this equipment and then over a few years learning how to design this kind of equipment, it does make a change. And when you start building high-powered shortwave transmitters like the type that are used at, for example, the Voice of Hope in Africa, or WRMI, that has 14 high-powered units, you get a new perspective on life. You know, it was 1984, working for that transmitter manufacturer, I decided to buy a little car to use for work. I did some travel. I didn't have to take a whole lot of stuff with me when I traveled to maybe visit a radio station within a couple of 100 miles. And we decided to get a economy car for me to drive. And I remember this so well. I bought I'll be willing to admit this, some people may laugh at me, but I bought a little Plymouth Horizon, a nice little red Plymouth Horizon with a 4-speed transmission, and it ran quite well. And I bought it as a plain Jane. It had no options at all. It didn't even have air conditioning. It didn't even have a radio in it. I bought it plain Jane for cash. And I was able to put air conditioning in for less, factory air, I might add, for less than it would have cost at the dealer. And I remember being up in the New York City area, and I took a trip into Manhattan to look for a radio to put in the car. Now, maybe you don't know this, but it's something that I had learned growing up. There are some interesting, or were at that time, electronic stores near Times Square. And so I took the trip into Manhattan with my wife. We were up in the New York area, and I found this radio that would fit in the car. It was AM, FM cassette, but it also had international shortwave. It's something you don't normally see when you go to buy a car radio, and the price was right. And I thought, well, this is kind of fascinating. So I bought it. We installed it in the car, and I had this AM, FM cassette. Didn't use the cassette that much, and shortwave. And when I would travel around the United States, the company moved to the Atlanta, Georgia area. When I first went to work, I did have to move up. We moved to Long Island to work initially for the first 7 months, and then the company moved south, and we moved with the company. My wife loved that, to be back in Georgia. I loved working there. I really did. And there were times that I would have to travel maybe to a station in South Carolina, North Florida, Alabama, even as far as Mississippi and Arkansas over those period of years, to maybe go do a repair and spend a couple of days assessing a place. And if it was close enough to drive, I would. If it was too far away, I would fly. But I traveled quite a bit during that time. And I can remember many a night getting in that car and driving back home or on the way somewhere, and I would flip the dial to the shortwave bands, and I started listening to stations from, the United States that were now owned by private corporations. I remember the first one I listened to was WRNO, which came out of New Orleans. I would hear them quite often, day and night. And there was a radio station owned by a group called Family Radio, and they were WYFR. And I would hear them quite often on a number of frequencies. I can still remember their top-of-the-hour logo music when they would change frequency was the hymn, "To God Be the Glory." And I always wondered what that place looked like, WYFR. It was in Okeechobee, Florida. Never would I believe that 25 years later I'd be working at that same facility with different call letters, WRMI. And I work now, when I'm there part-time, on some of the very transmitters that they were building and using in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And I work on some of that equipment to this day, I picked up a unique understanding of shortwave and the powerful voice that it is during that time, and learned a lot about the technology that you would never have really learned working at a radio station like I did. When you work on the equipment and you design it, you build it, you know it intimately. And people to this day can call me about equipment that I had worked with over the years, and I can remember the things that may or may not go wrong just because we saw all these things in the factory. It was a great job and a great educational experience. No doubt about that. A great educational experience. And little did I know why it was going to be important in the next phase of my life. I can sit here for the next half hour and talk to you about the engineering side and the technical, but I'm not, because unless you're a ham operator or you've done this, a lot of what I would say wouldn't make any sense. But I built equipment that was large and very powerful, and there are transmitters that I have personally supervised their construction and tested and worked on their design that are in literally every continent of the world. There are transmitters that I have constructed that are in the Middle East, in the United States, in Canada, in South America, in Africa, even a few in the islands of the Pacific that we built at that facility over the years that I was there. And it, like I say, it was all by, I think, divine intervention. The way I fell into that job with a transmitter manufacturer, once again, I look back, I really didn't have on paper what most people would think I would need for the qualifications. I didn't have the extensive electronics education. I didn't have decades of experience behind me. I had less than a decade of engineering experience and a 2-year associate's degree, and that's it. But somehow it worked, it came together, and it changed my life again in ways that I can't begin to explain. Getting off the radio and going to engineering, then from engineering into the environment that I was in, was a big change for my wife and I. And we came to a place around 1986 that I started wrestling inside with something inside of me that was a part of me from a very young age. And I would sleep at night and wake up around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I would have these thoughts that there's something missing in this equation of where I should be and what I should be doing. I liked working where I was at. That was not the issue. I loved working at that manufacturing plant. I loved the job. I loved the people. I loved the extensive travel. I got to travel to the National Association of Broadcasters convention every year to Las Vegas or wherever it was being held, and the radio-only shows that were held in a number of cities around the United States. I got to visit places I never thought I would get to because of installation work or design or repair all over the United States. I traveled frequently by air and loved every bit of it. But something inside said there's another change yet to come into your life. And I said last week that your life is the sum of all of your experiences and all the people that come in and out of your life. From the time that I was a young disc jockey to the time that I became an engineer, each was a stepping stone to get me to the next place. Now, how does that work in your life? Maybe you can relate to what I'm telling you. You start here, you go there, and you end up in this other location. In my case, I really feel, beyond the shadow of any doubt that I could ever have, that every step, in spite of the mistakes that I made, in spite of the imperfection of who I am, every one of these steps had a purpose. I learned something at every step of the way to do things that I would do next in life. I didn't stay in one part of the business. I learned all about the business, the on-air, the marketing, the management, the engineering. It's an entire package to make a radio station run. And then I started dealing with these, how do I put it? Started dealing with something inside of me that was beginning to talk to me that goes way back to a very different time in my life. Before I forget, this is Your Weekend Show, and I'm your host, Bob Biermann. You can find out about the program at yourweekendshow.com. That is yourweekendshow.com. And also find us on Facebook. Just look for Your Weekend Show. You know, it would mean a lot to me if you're listening to this program today, whether online or on the air, on shortwave. Would you send me an email? Would you let me know that you're out there? It would mean so much to me this particular week as we are kind of wrapping up this series of how I got into radio and what radio meant to me over all this time. And for me at this age to be able to sit behind a microphone and for you to hear me share this story means the world to me, and I hope that you will maybe find that time to let me know that you do listen. Yeah, the 1980s were a time of transition, primarily engineering in a rapid way, but also a time where there was an unrest inside of me. And part of that goes back to the way I was raised as a child. I began to remember the person I was when I was much younger, the person I was when I was in high school. And one of the negative sides of being a disc jockey was, you know, you get away from some of the important things in life. You're so consumed by being a personality, you forget. You forget there are other things in life. I'm very blessed. The woman that I married was a very tolerant woman and encouraging person. Our marriage survived quite well, and I can think of others where that would have not been the case. But I got to this place in the 1980s, in my early 30s, and I'm thinking, is this where I really want to be? Is this where I'm supposed to be? And I started wrestling with this voice inside that there is more to this life, and in particular, there is more to your life. And it's time, once again, for a change.
What you gonna do with the 36 cents? Stick you with coke on your floorboard when a woman on the street is huddled in the cold on a sidewalk vent trying to keep warm. Do you call her over, hand her the change, ask her a story, ask her her name, or do you tell yourself you're just a fool to believe you can change the world? You're just a fool to believe you can change the world. Oh, what you gonna do when you're watching TV and an ad comes on? Yeah, you know the kind, flashing up pictures of a child in need. For a dime a day you could save a life. Do you call the number, reach out a hand, or do you change the channel, call it a scam? Or do you tell yourself you're just a fool to believe you can change the world? Don't listen to them when they say you're just a fool to believe you can change the world. Oh, the smallest thing can make all the difference. Love is alive, don't listen to them when they say you're just a fool to believe you can change the world. The world's so big it can break your heart, and you just wanna help, not sure where to start, so you close your eyes, you send up a prayer into the dark. You're just a fool to believe you can change the world. Don't listen to them when they say you're just a fool to believe you can change the world. Oh, the smallest thing can make all the difference. Love is alive, don't you listen to them when they say you're just a fool to believe you can change the world.
Changing the world. Little did I know at the time that I was wrestling with a change in my life that I was going to, well, be a small part of changing other people's lives. Let me kind of explain. When I was younger, long before I became a disc jockey, I was raised, as I said, in Long Island, very active in a church, in a choir. And there were many times that I had considered doing something in terms of even ministry in my life. I had grandparents that thought I should go to college and then seminary and become a pastor of a church. They thought that was my calling in life. Of course, as a teenager, I had the radio bug that bit me so seriously, and I wanted to be a radio announcer. And as I told you before, there's always been this, what I call hand of providence, that I never saw at the time, leading and directing every step of the way in ways I never could understand. Why did I feel the need to leave on the air at the, quote, peak of the radio announcer career? Why did I leave a radio station for a manufacturing job when I was at the peak of that career and could have excelled into big radio markets around the country, maybe even become down the road a vice president of engineering for a large corporate owner? And why at this time, working for a transmitter manufacturer and doing that kind of work, am I hitting this place in life where I'm feeling a need for a change? When I worked there at that transmitter manufacturer, everything was great. I had a good paycheck. I had very flexible hours for me and lots of time off and weekends definitely off, and even had my wife working part-time for me so we could even be together more. Traveled a lot. It was a great life. Why would I want to leave that now? What would be inspiring me to do that? I had wrestled with those thoughts several times in my life to make the change I was about to make. And I remember it was probably a few months, maybe 6 months before I'm really wrestling with this at night, that I had visited a radio station that had one of the transmitters our company had built, and they were wanting to make some modifications as they were doing some upgrades, and I advised them of how that could be done. And it was at that place, it was a college in, of all places, my wife's hometown of Toccoa, Georgia. It was Toccoa Falls College. They owned a radio station they had built several years before. It wasn't much to look at as far as a big FM radio station should look. It had all the basics, had a very tiny budget, and a lot of high hopes. And I ran into a man that I had known way back in the early 1970s in upstate New York. He had owned a radio station up there, and I had met him on occasion, and he tried to get me to be a disc jockey working for him, but I had other plans. And here he is. He's actually a trustee of this college, and he's helping oversee their non-commercial radio operation in his retirement. And he said it would be wonderful to get a person with a radio background like yours to work here at the college, and we can then help them show how a radio station can be more than just a ministry. It can be a radio ministry that has a real impact that can cause change in people's lives. He said, I would do anything to get you to work for us, except we don't have a whole lot of money. For weeks after that visit to the college, I wrestled with it for quite a long time. I remember getting up one night. It was about maybe 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, and I just couldn't sleep. It's just eating at me about, should I go to this college? Should I give up this income and move back to this small town in Georgia and take on this, what to me was kind of a small radio station? And I got up, and I'm sitting in our living room, and I'm just kind of thinking about it. My wife walks in and she says, you can't sleep? And I said, no, I'm having a hard time sleeping tonight. And she said, what are you wrestling with? You've been bothered by something for a while. And And with tears in my eyes, I told her, I said, I'm thinking about accepting a job at Toccoa Falls College to help with their broadcast ministry. And she said, what does your heart tell you to do? I said, honestly, in spite of the fact that there's not a whole lot of money in this, my heart is saying to do it. To call them up and say, let's talk about this, and perhaps maybe I will take the job. And she said, if it's what we're supposed to be doing, you should know of all people, with what you know, the way you were raised, that you don't worry about the income if it's a calling in life. The next afternoon, I made the telephone call. I planned on making it a couple of times, but never could get the courage up. But I finally did. I said, I may take you up on that offer if it's still there. And he said, oh, it certainly is. And the next week, I drove up to Toccoa, Georgia, just a couple of hours drive, and talked and looked at it and thought about it and made the decision right then and there that we are going to answer this call. And we made the move. And I'm going to tell you about what happened there. But I want to say this much first. I told you I believe in divine intervention. It's amazing. It wasn't that many years after I left that transmitter company, they ran into financial trouble. The radio station that I had left to go to the transmitter company, it got sold, and I would have probably been out of a job. I look back at every place that I left, something happened shortly after I left that would have impacted my life. I didn't see it at the time, but that's exactly what happened. And here I am getting ready to pick up and move everything one more time to the small town of Toccoa, Georgia. Now understand, we had done pretty well for ourselves over the years. And as I said before, we never saw the handwriting on the wall of change occurring at the places we were at. It just seemed that something always fell in our lap at the exact time that we needed something in our lives. From that first radio station I worked at in upstate New York, it too sold a year or two later, changed formats, and I would have probably been out of a job. Every place that I worked at in radio, shortly after I left that station, it went through a dramatic change. And it's like the hand of God, that's the only way to describe it, guided and directed me out at the right time and prepared me for the next step of my journey in life. I think the hardest thing for me to understand at that time was everything that I had ever done to that point in my life, all the way back to listening to radio, to liking the idea of being on the radio. All of those things had a huge impact in my life. The hobby radio station, that first job, all the things that I did to understand what the radio business side was all about were about to become very much in play in this next chapter in our lives. I didn't see it then. And we're going to share about that next weekend. Would you be here at your weekend show? Until next week at this same time, may God richly bless you.